Welcome to the Excel Pivot Tables demonstration. In this video, you'll learn how to create and customize a pivot table in Microsoft Excel using exported data. For demonstration purposes, test data will be used throughout this video. A pivot table is a powerful Excel feature that allows you to quickly summarize, organize, and analyze large amounts of data without changing the original dataset. Instead of manually reviewing hundreds or even thousands of rows, pivot tables help you quickly organize information into meaningful reports. This worksheet contains test data that has already been exported into Excel. Notice that the dataset contains multiple rows and columns of information. Reviewing this data manually can make it difficult to identify meaningful trends or answer reporting questions. Before creating a pivot table, verify that the data is continuous with no blank rows or columns. Excel uses this continuous range to determine which cells belong to the dataset. To create a pivot table, select the Insert tab, then select Pivot Table. Since this demonstration uses data already stored in Excel, the Use an External Data Source option is not needed. You have the option to place the pivot table in an existing worksheet or create it in a new one. Existing worksheet allows you to specify a location within the current workbook. For this demonstration, select New Worksheet, then select OK. Excel has created a new worksheet containing an empty pivot table and the Pivot Table Fields pane. Rename the worksheet by double-clicking the Worksheet tab or by right-clicking the tab and selecting Rename. Excel automatically detects the source data and lists each column as an available field. One of the primary advantages of a pivot table is that it allows you to reorganize and summarize information without affecting the original worksheet. Everything displayed in the pivot table is simply another view of the same data. To build the pivot table, drag fields into the four areas. Filters limit what data is displayed in the pivot table. Columns organize information across the top of the table. Rows organize information vertically. Values perform calculations such as sums, counts, averages, minimums, or maximums. For this example, we'll drag SAP Cost Center to the Filters area. Next, we'll drag the worker, employee ID, months, and accounting date fields to rows. Ledger account will go into columns. And ledger budget debit amount will go into values. As each field is added, Excel automatically builds the pivot table based on where the fields are placed. Notice that the ledger budget debit amount values are displayed as general numbers rather than currency. To format these values, select the drop-down arrow beside ledger budget debit amount. Select Number Format. Select Currency, and then select OK twice. The values now appear as currency. Once you've finished adding fields, close the Pivot Table Fields pane to provide additional workspace. The field list can be displayed again at any time by selecting Field List on the Pivot Table Analyze tab, or by right-clicking inside the pivot table and selecting Show Field List. Whenever the pivot table is selected, the Pivot Table Analyze and Design tabs become available on the ribbon. These tabs disappear when selecting outside the pivot table. Notice that the row fields appear in a nested hierarchy. The order of the fields in the rows area determines how information is grouped. In this example, worker is the primary level, employee ID is the second level, months follows employee ID, and accounting date is nested beneath months. Across the top of the pivot table, the ledger account field appears as column headings, while SAP Cost Center appears as a filter above the table. Changing the filter immediately updates the pivot table, allowing you to quickly focus on a specific subset of data without affecting the original worksheet. The Design tab controls both the appearance and layout of the pivot table. Use subtotals and grand totals to control summary information. Select Report Layout to switch between compact, outline, and tabular layouts. Compact form combines row fields into a single column, outline form separates each field into its own column, and tabular form presents the data in a traditional table format. You can also enable banded rows or banded columns to improve readability by adding alternate shading. Finally, Excel provides several built-in pivot table styles that allow you to quickly apply a different color theme. Let's return to the Pivot Table Analyze tab. Because the row fields are nested, you can display different levels of detail by expanding or collapsing the hierarchy. Select the plus or minus icons to expand or collapse individual groups. To expand or collapse an entire field at once, right-click the desired field, select Expand/Collapse, and then choose Expand Entire Field or Collapse Entire Field. Keep in mind that the field you right-click determines which level of the hierarchy is expanded or collapsed. This provides an easy way to control the level of detail displayed in your report. Pivot tables can also be sorted in multiple ways to make information easier to analyze. You can use Excel's standard sort commands from the Data tab, or use the built-in pivot table sorting options. Pivot tables also provide several filtering options. Using the drop-down menus, you can apply label filters to filter text-based fields or value filters to filter calculated values. The available filter options change depending on the field that is currently selected. Because filtering is context-sensitive, the active field determines which filtering choices are available. Filters can be cleared at any time to restore the full dataset. One thing to note is if the source data changes, the pivot table does not update automatically. To display the latest information, right-click anywhere inside the pivot table and select Refresh, or use the Refresh command on the Pivot Table Analyze tab. Refreshing ensures that the pivot table displays the most current changes made to the existing source data. If additional rows or columns are added to the source worksheet after the pivot table has been created, the original data range may no longer include the new information. Rather than creating a new pivot table, select Pivot Table Analyze, then choose Change Data Source. Update the source range to include the additional rows or columns, then select OK. Keep in mind that every column included in the source range must contain a valid column heading. If a column does not contain a header, Excel will display an error, and the data source cannot be updated until the issue is corrected. Pivot tables also allow you to create custom groups without modifying the original worksheet. Select multiple related items, right-click, and choose Group. The selected items become part of a custom group that can be expanded or collapsed independently from the remaining fields. Grouping can be useful when combining related categories into a single reporting category while leaving the original data unchanged. Slicers provide another way to filter pivot table data. Select Pivot Table Analyze, then choose Insert Slicer. Select one or more fields and choose OK. Each slicer displays the available values for its field as clickable buttons. Selecting a button filters the pivot table immediately. Hold the Control key while selecting buttons to filter multiple values at once. Multiple slicers can be used together, making it easy to identify records that meet several conditions simultaneously. Slicers can also be connected to multiple pivot tables, allowing them to function as interactive dashboard controls. Pivot tables can also be used to create pivot charts. Select Pivot Table Analyze, then choose Pivot Chart. The pivot chart remains connected to the pivot table. As filters or slicers are applied, both the chart and the pivot table update automatically to display the same information. This makes pivot charts an effective way to visualize summarized data while maintaining the flexibility of the underlying pivot table. This concludes the Excel Pivot Tables demonstration. You should now be able to create a pivot table to summarize, organize, and analyze data in Excel.